Okay.
Hey, little turkey.
If you brought her a turkey, she would eat it. she would eat a turkey. Okay, we're looking at, we're still looking at Luke. Remember, one of the things that we always, and we'll see it again today, we want to look at, remember, Luke is writing this gospel, and I think this is something I'm becoming more and more aware of as I lead these, because I look at notes I took when I did it back even like 2 years ago here, and some of my perspective it's changed a little bit, and I don't know that I know I haven't in the past haven't given enough credit to the evangelist writing
I didn't give her anything.
to an audience. That their mission, I don't believe, and I want to preface this with that rather than make it sound like it's absolute. I don't believe they're just writing down information, sort of nice to know information. And they're not writing biographies just to write down biographies. I think what they're doing is they're shaping these stories to convey a message to their audience. And it's important to know the audience, the nature of the audience, and that's why the Gospels are different, because there are different audiences, and therefore you have different evangelists, and Paul, and others, that are writing to churches that are facing issues, that they want the church to take away something. So I think I've become more and more conscious of that becomes an intention, or at least I'm approaching it a little different, that's the intention of these evangelists, and that's certainly, I think, what's going on in Luke. And for that reason, I think the people in the story, but Luke is doing it in a way that's different than like Paul. Because when Paul is writing to a church, he'll say, stop doing this. Stop doing this, or start doing this, because he's very blunt. These evangelists are doing the same thing, only they're shaping it within their telling of the gospel story, the good news story. And so it's a little more subtle than Paul would do, or I would do if I'm preaching a sermon, because that gets fairly specific. And so it's really, I guess, it's really important to know who Jesus is, to whom he's speaking in the story, because that tells us who the evangelist really wants to listen to what he's saying. And I think we've seen that before, and we're certainly going to see it in the material we're looking at today. And we've got different audiences in the Gospel of Luke, and I'll tell you, they're the same audiences we see in the other Gospels. I mean, this is not different. These are the same people, maybe because outside of John, the three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all sort of grounded in Mark's Gospel. And they're all adding to and reshaping the Gospel of Mark. And so maybe that's one reason they use the same group. What are the groups that we've seen? The three major groups in the Gospel of Luke. Human groups in the Gospel of Luke. And I'm not talking about people who are demon-possessed or people who are ailing.
The crowds.
Okay, you got crowds.
Pharisees.
You got Pharisees, and you've got...
What are they? Scribes.
Scribes and Pharisees. So you still got missing one.
The other one.
Really an important one. Maybe the most important group.
Besides Jesus.
Disciples. Yeah, you got disciples. Because a lot of what Luke is, in fact, most of what Luke is writing is to
the disciples.
Because he's writing it to Christians in his church. So he's writing it to people who identify themselves as disciples, which is a good thing because it means he's writing it to us. It resonates with us. Because that's, of those three groups, we sure don't identify with the scribes and the Pharisees. I hope we don't. If we did, we wouldn't be here. We don't identify with the crowds because the crowds are just hanging around. They're the ones sleeping on Sundays, which is fine. That's what crowds do. They sleep in. They don't feel hatred towards, they don't feel hostility. They just don't care. They're just out there. and disciple. So we are disciples, therefore this resonates with us. And I think this is something Luke is very intentional. And if we're aware of that, it kind of changes the way we read stuff going on in Luke. And like I said, I think that also applies certainly to Matthew and Mark, probably to John, but John is a little more complicated. Okay, so we've got these groups, and as Jesus has been moving to Jerusalem, although we have seen the different groups come out, on whom has he primarily focused between Peter's confession, you are the Christ of God, or you are the Messiah of God, and his entry into Jerusalem? Which of those three groups has Jesus really focused? Where is he focused?
Disciples.
Disciples. Most of what he's written has been to disciples. It's the disciples who are there. And he's gone through all kinds of lessons about how they should pray and how they should deal with distractions and how they should deal with property and opposition. And sometimes these other groups come in, and sometimes Jesus addresses them, but a lot of times when we talked about it, when he addresses particularly the scribes and the Pharisees, remember Luke's community is facing opposition. They're facing those other two groups. They're facing crowds that are just out there. They haven't made an opinion. They're just hanging around on the edge. They're also facing really hostility. Groups that are actively hostile towards the church. And so as he's dealing with it, not only is he teaching the disciples how to pray better and how to use their possessions and about humility and faith and the danger of stumbling, he's also pointing out that these oppositions, the opposition they feel towards Jesus, is the same sort of opposition they feel towards the church, this same group of people. And I think you could say it's similar to the opposition that Christians face now by people who are openly hostile to Christianity and the church. So it's something to file away. These little things become helpful, I think, as we read it, because we're able to sort of zero in on, what this has for us without, kind of reading it and saying, now what does this mean to me? I think that's dangerous. So you have to look at it in the context as well. But I think this is helpful. Okay. Anyway, last week we had Jesus. It was pretty dramatic last week.
I wasn't here.
And and that was the second reason it was dramatic, because Shelley wasn't here. And if you remember, we had that long discussion.
Don't tell her you were talking about her. Just,
it wasn't about you.
Oh, okay.
So we, other than that, what is the? It was pretty dramatic. What happened last week that was and remember, Luke is shaping this story, so he's not an idiot. He knows what he's doing. What were two things that were really dramatic that happened last week?
He drove out the selling. Those who were selling.
Okay, one thing, and we'll say that's the second one. We'll focus on that. He drove out the people who were selling. And remember, when we looked at that, we kind of compared it to the same story in Matthew, Mark, and John, and we saw some differences in the way Luke kind of shaped this cleansing of the temple. That in the other three, he's chasing out people selling animals, drives out the animals, drives out the money changers. Things that were very associated with Jewish worship, really strong in the Gospel of John, because he even says it, talks about his body being, given. And the other two, this parable of the fig tree withering. This is all about worship, but that's not the case in Luke. Luke doesn't have that story about the fig tree, and he doesn't mention chasing out money changers and animals. He just chases out people who are selling things in the temple, which kind of changes the meaning a little bit. That maybe this is something other than a judgment on Jewish worship. And I think the reason he does it we can see in what we're looking at today. So that was one dramatic thing. He cleanses his Father's house, right? What else does he do? How did he get to the point where he could cleanse his Father's house?
He came on a donkey.
Yeah, okay. We have looked at half the Gospel of Luke, and half the Gospel of Luke has been Jesus doing what? Moving towards Jerusalem, right? What happened last week?
He arrived.
He arrived, right? And he arrived in Jerusalem on a donkey, which fulfills this prophecy of Zechariah, that this is a royal image. Now again, a little different than we saw in the other Gospels. When he arrives, who is it that's shouting? You remember who was shouting? What's that?
The disciples?
The disciples were shouting, not the crowds or the people. That's what we see in the other Gospels. Luke says it was the disciples that were shouting.
It's a whole multitude.
Yeah, the multitude was there, but it was the disciples who were recognizing it.
Whole multitude.
Yeah.
Multitude of disciples.
Of the disciples, right.
Which makes you feel like there's more than just the 12.
Just the 12, right. They're all, but it's the ones who are doing it are the followers. Now, I think again, that's not an accident that Luke does it, because that's not what we see in the other three. We have people doing it, which changes a little bit. In fact, we even saw that the crowds who were sort of there said that the scribes and the Pharisees were part of the crowd. Which becomes kind of a significant thing, because the crowds are going to play a role later in the story. And so that connection that we didn't see, maybe we're starting to see a connection there. Okay, so he's entered, and at the end of what we looked at last week, Jesus, which I think explains how at least Luke sees the cleansing, what is Jesus about to do? What we saw at the end of what we were looking at the end of chapter 19, what is Jesus getting ready to do?
And the temple.
Okay, boom, temple. What's he going to be doing in the temple?
Teaching.
He's going to be teaching. He's going to be teaching at the temple, which may explain at least how Luke sees the necessity of cleansing it. We need to cleanse the temple because that's where Jesus is going to be teaching. Now, if this is where he's teaching, and I'm going to tell you, this teaching at the temple is just about it for Jesus' teaching. How do you think Luke is going to use that? In other words, when Jesus offers this last bit of teaching, how do you think Luke viewed the content of that teaching? I mean, Jesus has been teaching the whole way. How do you think he viewed these last lessons that Jesus is giving there in the temple?
Who are you asking about?
How do you think Luke would view it? And based on how Luke would view it, how should we view these last lessons that Jesus is teaching in the temple?
That they're very important.
Okay, that they're really
to pay attention.
If we're going to pay attention to anything, this is what we want to pay attention to. Okay, because it must be important. He saved it to the end. Okay? Interesting, some of the things that we see in Matthew and Mark in these last teachings, Luke has dealt with earlier. He's taken those same lessons and moved them earlier in the gospel. In fact, Jesus' teaching in the temple is a little shorter in Luke than it is in the others. So anyway, so it must be important because Luke has saved it for the end. This is this is close to the culmination where the story really starts moving. Okay, now, so Jesus is there, temple's been cleansed, he's ready to teach, we need to listen. What happens on day one? In chapter 20, verse 1.
The chief priests and the teachers of the law together with the elders came to him.
Okay, we got people in the temple, right? Now, they're not the crowds. They're not the oiklos, but they're people. They're people in the temple, right? Mm-hmm. And what is he teaching them?
The gospel.
Okay, teaching them the gospel, the good news, the euangelion. And remember, I told you right at the beginning, one of the things, when you look at the word gospel, the word euangelion in Greek has a very specific meaning. It was when a battle was fought outside the city, a runner would come from the battlefield into the city, and announce if there was a victory, whether their army won or lost. And if the army lost, then the city's in big trouble. That means the enemy's going to come, it's going to besiege the city, it's going to be bad. It's going to be a bad deal. But if the army wins, that means life will continue the way it was. Okay? And when it's good news, when that runner announces good news in that city, it was called euangelion. That's what the person would announce. After the Battle of Marathon, that's what the runner in Greece ran. That's why they called it a marathon. He ran, 3.2 miles back to Athens and announced, euangelion, we have defeated the Persians. They are not going to lay siege to Athens. You will not be eating your pets, although it's really tempting now as she barks. That's not going to happen because you won victory. That's what euangelion, that's what Jesus is announcing. That's what the word means. So it's not just gospel in general. This is specific good news, really good news. Good news of massive change. Okay, so he's teaching that. We see scribes, chief priests, and scribes there. Now, we know that scribes aren't... Why is he mentioning chief priests? We haven't talked much about chief priests earlier in the gospel. Why would we be talking about chief priests now?
Where are we?
Chapter 20.
Okay.
Why would we be talking about chief priests?
Because they're in the temple.
Right.
And they're coming to...
Because they have authority, they're the chiefs.
Yeah, they're in the temple. He's in the temple. He hadn't been in the temple. That's where the chief priests hang out. They don't wander around. They're there. So we've got the chief priests, and what do we know at least? And he's there with scribes. And what do we know about scribes? Because we've talked a lot about scribes.
They study the law.
They know the law, and how do they feel about Jesus?
They don't like him.
They don't like it. They don't like it. So we, the reader, we, the disciples who are reading this, the scribes are always the ones who are the opposition, right? And so they ask a question. Now, as they start their question, if it's a question coming from scribes, we already know the nature of the question. We don't even need to read it. What's the intention of the question? Why are they asking Jesus a question?
Entrapment.
They're going to try to entrap him. They're not looking for information. This is not to get more information from Jesus. They're asking a question to trap him, right? Now, what is the question that they ask?
Where do you get the authority to do this?
Okay, where do you get the authority to do the things that you do? Now, why is that a dangerous question for Jesus?
Because if he answers it, truthfully tell him that he is God's, he is the Son of God, then
That would be blasphemy.
Okay, that's going to be a problem.
yes.
Why might it be, when you think about it, why might that also be a difficult question for Luke's church? I mean, if the opposition here, if I'm right, and the opposition to Jesus is, as Luke shapes his story, is similar to the opposition that Luke's church faces, why might that become a challenging question for them? By whose authority are you doing these things?
Because they need to know. They need to be able to stick up for themselves or tell the truth with authority.
Right. Which tells that there may be people that are questioning their authority to do much of anything, particularly if they're Jews. If these are Jewish, if this is Jewish opposition, how dare you talk about, the Old Testament? How dare you talk about God? How dare you talk about the Christus, the Christ, the Messiah? What authority do you have to take such radical, to interpret our Old Testament, our law, in such a radical way? What authority who do you think you are doing that?
He doesn't really answer someone, kind of skirts it.
That's really interesting. Now, this is a question that Jesus has asked, right? And I think when they hear the question, his audience is thinking, yeah, we get asked that same kind of question ourselves. These Jews are asking us that same question. Therefore, Jesus' answer there, I wonder how Jesus answers. Because maybe Jesus' answer should be, or can be, our answer too. Maybe we can follow his example, and when we face those kind of questions, we can answer in the same way. And that's why Jesus' answer becomes interesting, right? Because they ask that question, and Jesus' response is what?
And asks them a question.
He turns it around and asks them a question. And what is the question that he asks?
I will also ask you a question. Tell me, John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men?
Okay. Now, how does that put them in a difficult position? How does that put them in a difficult position?
If they answer it's from heaven, then
They're acknowledging John as...
yes.
Right, and that creates a problem because, particularly in the Gospel of Luke.
Because the people saw John as a prophet.
Okay, people saw John as a prophet, saw John as important. We, the reader, see John as... We even see John as more than that,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, it says if they say from heaven, he'll ask, why didn't you believe him?
That's right. And because we know a backstory about John that...
John was born to make a way for Christ.
That's exactly right. And he is Jesus' cousin. And, we got this backstory in the Gospel of Luke about John. So we know a lot about John the Baptist. So we know who he is. So ask this question, did John come from heaven or is human? If they say heaven, then the question is, then why didn't you believe him?
Yeah.
If they say, well, he was just another person, what's the problem there?
If they say it's from men, all people will stone us.
Okay, why?
Because they are persuaded that John was a prophet.
Okay, they're persuaded, they believe. So they're going to have to they're either going to have to say he was... get that in a minute. It's kind of interesting. If he says he's from heaven, then why didn't you believe him? If he's not from heaven, then people who think he's from heaven are going to be on your case, right?
Yeah.
And so what do they end up doing?
Saying they don't know.
They end up saying that they don't know. Now, why is that ironic? Irony is when somebody says something that the reader says, that has a real deeper meaning. Than the people in the story realize. When those scribes say, we don't know where he's from.
It's almost like, because they were well-learned in the Old Testament. They knew what they knew, and they weren't afraid to say they knew what they knew. When Jesus asked them that question.
That sounds like something I'd say.
I make my point. So when they got asked that question, they had to say, I don't know. That was kind of like an oxymoron.
Good. Why? These are they saying the truth? Now we know why they say I don't know. They say I don't know because they don't want to get in trouble, right? Luke's already said that. But do they know?
I don't think they really do.
I don't think they do either.
All they're trying to do is say, if we say this was what will happen. If we say this was what will happen.
They're questioning it. They themselves are questioning it.
We, the reader in the story, know that these guys are in the dark, right? They don't know much because they don't know God, right? They've been, so when they say, I don't know, in the immediate story, they say it to get out of trouble. But on a deeper level, they really don't know. Because they don't know God. And they sure as heck don't know John the Baptist.
Correct. They don't know the truth.
They don't know the truth.
They don't know the truth,
Yes.
but they do believe in their humanity, wisdom. They're self-absorbed within their own truth.
And remember, how does Luke view the truth held by the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees? Does he have any respect for their truth? Zero. In fact, remember, and I keep on going back to it, for Luke, what's the reason they're going to kill Christ? Why do they want to kill Christ?
Because he does good things.
Because he does good things. That's the reason. It's not about power. It's not about preserving their place. I mean, all of that may be true, but for Luke, it's because Jesus does good things instead of, and good things, period. He does good things.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus does good things, and that's why they decided to kill
I
him.
know, that's what kills me about them.
Now,
You know, they're-
that's right. Now, that's how Luke sees him, which means he wants the audience to see him as bad. They're bad. Like I said, you don't have Nicodemus in Luke. You know, the Pharisee who changes, who ends up bearing Jesus' body. You know, see that? Pharisees that change. Pharisees are bad. Now, Luke is writing to a community where the opposition are Pharisee Jews, for crying out loud. You know, he can't afford to say, well, there are some good ones in there. No, those are the guys who are really trashing you. You know, don't trust them. You know, you got all kinds of people you can witness to. Don't worry about them. You survive them. You worry about the crowds that are around. You know, those are the ones that can hear. Those are the ones that can move. The ones who are on your case.
Tell me again, so there's the Jews, Luke's church is the Jewish church.
Luke's church is a Christian church made up, I think, of very sophisticated Jews. Jews who really know their Old
You
Testament.
don't get any more.
So who are the Pharisees and
done.
the scribes?
The scribes, and we're going to talk about this
I know
in
you
just
already told us.
we're going to do it. What you have around the turn of the first century, you've got an interesting thing in the church. And we see that in the gospel of Matthew, but I think even stronger in Luke. Because the church is made up of Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah. It's not made up of Gentiles. It's made up of Jews who see Messianic Jews. Jews who believe that Jesus is the Christ, is the Christus. Those are the ones who are making up Luke, I believe Luke's church, certainly Matthew's church. That's why in Matthew, he's constantly saying Jesus did this to fulfill prophecy. If it was a Gentile church, they don't care. You know, they don't care if Jesus fulfills Jewish prophecy. Who cares? Only a Jew would care that Jesus fulfills Jewish prophecy. So he's writing to a Jewish congregation. You know, but one that doesn't know their Bible very well. That's why he's got to constantly say, Jesus did this to fulfill prophecy. Like the Zechariah, the entry into Jerusalem. Matthew says, Coco, come here. Come here.
You're not getting any more. You've had
Yeah.
two big things. That's
Luke's, that's why Matthew says it, because they don't know the Old Testament. Luke does the same thing, only he doesn't have to say, Jesus did this, said this, to fulfill prophecy. Because I think his congregation knew. He didn't have to say it because they knew it. And see, so I think it was a very sophisticated Jewish congregation. Did they have some Gentile? Maybe, but not many. And the Gentiles they had were probably Gentiles who had become Jewish, you know, that were following Jewish law. We see that in Acts, because in Acts, although they don't have to circumcise, they're supposed to follow Jewish dietary laws, according to Acts, Gentile Christians. So this becomes, so you've got the Messianic Jews, just a few that believe Jesus is the Messiah. Most of the Jews are Pharisaic Jews that are focused, they see their identity focused on the law. It's where you see your identity as a Jew. And we're going to see later Sadducees mentioned. They saw their identity centered on temple worship. That's where the Sadducees saw. Pharisees saw it centered on the law that Moses gave. Messianic Jews saw it centered on the Christus, the Christ, the Messiah who's come. Now what we're going to see happen after the first century is Messianic Jews disappear. And Christianity becomes more and more focused on Gentiles, non-Jews. Greeks, very successful with the Greeks, not so successful with Jews. And so this Jewish sect kind of disappears in the first century. And you have more and more Christians who are coming from a non-Jewish background, and that's why you see more and more Greek philosophy sort of integrated into Christian theology. That's where a lot of things start changing in terms of what Christians believe, because it's not Jewish anymore. It's more shaped by Gentile ideas. because they're the Christians.
In here, like where the Christians, they're basically not liked, or
Yeah,
whatever. It
yeah.
still is that today. It's
Yeah.
still the whole way through to today even.
Absolutely, and that's why I think this can resonate with us. And in fact, the fact that Jesus responds with a question that puts them off, that kind of becomes an important question for answer for Christians. That maybe when we're confronted, maybe the response isn't to sort of play their game, but rather turn it. It's okay. When somebody is looking to trap you, it's okay not to go into great depth and explain and explain and explain, but just turn it. Because, and question their hypocrisy, question, what they're saying, question their motivation. That's okay to do. Rather than to kind of confront. It's where you choose to fight your battles. Kind of interesting. And what I find really interesting is he does this before he's done anything else. This is the first thing he does in the temple, which becomes, I think, an important lesson for Luke's church, becomes an important lesson for us. Certainly in the story, Jesus has established his authority. So his teaching, what he's going to say after that, has more meaning, carries more weight, because he's already silenced the ones who are opposing him, right? And after this encounter, boom, he's had this encounter with the Pharisees. Shut him up by asking them a question that they refuse to answer. And his response then to them is what? When they refuse to answer his question about John the Baptist, how does he respond to them?
He tells them he's not going to.
Yeah, I'm not going to answer you either. He doesn't go into great depths about the theology behind the Messiah. He doesn't spend 5 minutes talking to him about it. He says, you're not going to answer me. I'm not going to answer you. I'm not going to answer you. But then he does tell a parable. And to whom is he telling the parable?
Us.
He's telling to the people, right? The people who were there. And what is the parable that he offers?
The tenants of the vineyard.
He offers the parable of the tenants. Okay, and what is going on in the parable of the tenants?
Well, the owner went away and left his people take care of the vineyard.
Okay.
And then he sent people back to get some of the stuff, and they beat him and killed him.
Okay, we got a vineyard, right? And vineyards always, that's a powerful image. What do vineyards tend to represent? If we look at like the Old Testament.
Wine.
Okay, represent wine. Okay, good. With that in mind, what do they represent? They seem to represent something in the Old Testament when you talk about vineyards.
Communion-like thing.
Well, kind of communion, but more more like a blessing.
Okay.
The vineyard is a sign of blessing. Especially if you look at Isaiah. He uses this vineyard image a lot. That the vineyard is this image of God's blessing grapes and prosperity and all this kind of stuff. So as soon as it says vineyard, boy, we got this loaded image, right? Mm-hmm. And the person who owns the vineyard, right?
Yeah.
He does what?
Goes away for a long
time.
Well,
first he leases it, doesn't give it.
Yeah.
He leases it to tenants, right?
Yeah.
And then he goes away. All right?
Yeah.
Now, why is this, before we even get into anything else, why would this be important for Jews? Why would this be, the idea that as he starts it, why might a Jewish ears perk up? That this vineyard was leased, this paradise, this wonderful land was given as a lease. And then the person goes away who gives it. How might that resonate with Jews? How might a Jew interpret that?
Well, it kind of is theirs, and it's a way to make money.
Okay, that God has given
them
what? What has God given them?
The vineyard and the wine.
Vineyard, what's that?
The blessing.
Blessings. Gave them land, right?
Mm-hmm.
The promised land, protection, presence, giving them. Now, what about disciples? I think this parable becomes interesting because I think it speaks on two levels. How might that resonate with a disciple? who's living after the crucifixion and the resurrection?
Right.
How might this resonate with them? What might they start thinking about? In other words, us. How might this sort of resonate with us?
The fact that they were running the vineyard, you mean?
Well,
Because God, as Christians who are in our faith, God has given us the blessings,
okay.
His grace, and He's going to come back.
Okay, Jesus is here, done this,
Correct.
blessings and all, and then He
Leaves and
leaves. But this isn't
Permanent.
ours, it's
His.
Yes.
His, leased to us,
Yeah.
right? And He's gone. So, it's kind of going on two levels here, I think. What happens when the harvest
Ouch.
comes?
He sent one of his servants back to get some of the harvest.
Now, we've run across harvests before in Luke. When is harvest becomes sort of symbolic of what? In other parables we've looked at, what does the harvest tend to represent?
People's souls.
Well, in what? Because harvest is not piecemeal. You don't have harvest like every day.
No,
Harvest is
once a year.
once a year. It's a time, right?
Mm-hmm.
What would be the time? Yeah, people. But what would be the time of the harvest? Because it's associated with a time. What would be the
The
harvest?
season.
The fall.
Okay, what would be the season?
Fall.
What is he talking about? That's when you harvest.
Yeah.
But for a Christian, what would that harvest represent? If the vineyard represents this place of blessing, God's presence, this abundance that God gives us,
It represents
and then He's gone. What would be the harvest?
Jesus.
Okay, what about Jesus?
Coming back to bring us.
Okay, when the harvest comes, that's when you talked about the harvest is ready. You just need workers to go out and harvest. Talked about the parable of the sower and the wheat's growing up, ready to harvest. What time is he talking about when that wheat is growing up?
Jesus' death and resurrection.
Okay, when He's raised and when He's resurrected, when the time comes for these people to be brought in. When would that occur? When would be
Our death.
Jesus.
Remember, we're not talking about something piecemeal. So
Jesus.
this isn't a lesson to individuals. Each of us will face our own individual harvest. What's that?
When we become believers.
Come of Jesus. We get going towards his
What
death.
if,
The promise.
and again, for us, because remember I just said we are very influenced by Gentile teaching, Greek philosophy. What if this harvest is like the time of the resurrection, which he's going to talk about later? This resurrection, that's when the harvest comes in, right? Mm-hmm. Not the resurrection of Jesus, but the resurrection of
Christianity.
us.
Of us. Okay.
The resurrection of the dead. When the dead are raised, right? Big deal in Jewish theology. This becomes the harvest. The Greeks are saying, no, that's wrong. But go with me. So we've got this time of harvest, which again, kind of makes sense for Christians even more so than to the Jews. That this time of harvest is going to come, and it's going to come, what's going to be associated with the coming of this harvest? When we're ready to bring in the wheat that's been raised, those fields that are rich with wheat, some of which have 40-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold grain. What is associated with the coming of that harvest? What's going to occur when that harvest, as a sign the harvest is ready? What's that?
Celebration.
It's going to be a time of celebration, right? Because we're bringing it in. Who's going to be there?
Everybody.
When is that harvest going to take place? When is that resurrection going to take place? Boom, when Jesus comes back. So we've got this harvest coming in, boom. Jesus is going to come back. Man, we got some loaded images, not just for scribes and Pharisees. It becomes loaded images for Christians. That this is now the tenets when the harvest is due, right? And the owner wants his share, right?
Yeah.
What does the owner do?
The owner or the
Yeah,
people
what does
from-
the owner do?
Oh, he sends.
Okay, he sends people to collect it,
Yeah.
right? And what do the tenants
They kill
do?
them. They beat them and kill them.
Okay, the tenants end up beating up the slaves. And then what does the owner do,
The
finally
second
decide to
one,
do?
He sent his son.
He's gonna send his son. And what do the tenants think?
Oh my, he's the heir. We can't let him live because then if he dies, we inherit.
Okay, somehow, what is the problem with the tenants? What have they missed?
The fact that they only rent the place.
They've missed that they only rent the place. It doesn't belong to them. What else have they missed? Because they've been in the vineyard for a while, haven't they? The owner hasn't sent slaves like weekly to check up on them. They've been pretty much doing what?
Treating it like
They've been
dirt.
doing what they want, right? They've been just living their lives. No indication that they were goofing around. They were using the vineyard. They were doing what they were supposed to. They were working the vineyard. They assumed it was theirs because they were working, and assumed that the owner's patience
With giving them permission.
was giving them permission, right? They misunderstood the owner's patience. In fact, they misunderstood it so badly that when the son comes, what do they end up doing?
Killing the son.
They end up killing the son, assuming that
They would inherit.
they would. Now, does that make, as a reader, does that make any sense?
No.
That is the dumbest assumption. That is the dumbest assumption you could make, right?
Yeah.
That somehow, if you kill the one who owns it, the son of the one who owns it, the owner is going to
Come back.
give it to you, right?
Give it to them.
Okay. What is the owner going to do?
Come back and take it back.
He's going to come back and take it, and what he's going to do when he takes it back?
Destroy those tenants.
Okay,
Yeah.
he's going to destroy the tenants and do what?
Give the vineyard.
Give the vineyard to somebody else. Now, if we look at it about Jews, with the Jews, how does that kind of fit into the Jewish history, or the scribes and the Pharisees? How might they identify with this parable?
Who, the Jews?
Yeah, the Jews.
I think they feel he's talking about them.
Yeah, he's talking about them, and it's even stronger in the other Gospels, because in the other Gospels, the people, he's saying this to the scribes and the Pharisees, and the writers say, they realize he was talking about them. But Luke doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. Instead, he leaves that kind of a little bit vague. How did they respond? Certainly they could respond like they do in Matthew and Mark and say, this is about us. How does this become a parable about us?
Because they run it for so many years.
Yes, God's done all this thing for us. Now all he wants is a portion of what he's given us the opportunity to do. He sent prophets to us, and we have rejected and killed prophets, and now he sends his son, and we're going to kill him too, and then he's going to take the vineyard back. Okay, boom. Matthew and Mark, really clearly, it's talking about Jews. Not so much in Luke. It's a little bit vague in Luke, because in Luke we also have this. We can have this idea of, maybe the tenants. And he's talking to the people, not to the scribes and Pharisees. Maybe the people can identify with this a little bit, and about what they're facing right now in their church. That Jesus has given them this, that we are the tenants.
As we sit today, that's the fact.
As we sit today, it's been a long time, right? And so we start assuming that this vineyard that God has given us belongs to
Us. And not
belongs to us,
instead of the
to be
owner.
used as
They see fit.
we see fit, right? And even though when we hear things questioning that, we can reject it because it belongs to
Us.
to us. Wrong. And that changes, this saying with harvest kind of changes the meaning of harvest. So now we've got a future harvest that we're going to face, this resurrection of the dead, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, that harvest is going to come. And when the Son comes, for Christians reading this isn't the Son coming the first time. This is the Son coming the final time, the second time. And if we reject the Son that second time, then we've missed the whole purpose of the vineyard. We have absolutely missed that. So I think in Luke, he's using this on two levels. He takes stuff out of the other ones that makes it very focused on Jews. And he makes it a little bit vague, because I think his audience wants to take it, apply it to themselves. I think this is really cool, what's happening here. And that's why the people who hear it say, in the other Gospels, the people who hear it say, that he's talking about us. But that's not how the people respond in Luke. They respond by saying what?
God forbid.
God forbid, heaven forbid, that this should happen. Heaven forbid this should happen. I think this is a parable that is intended to hit closer to home to Christians than it is to Jews. I think. Okay, so anyway, they end up responding, and how does Jesus interpret the parable? And now his interpretation, which is the same in Matthew and Mark, but has a slightly different meaning. If this parable is also directed at Christians, how does Jesus interpret this as he looks at them?
He said to them, what does it mean then? The meaning of which is written, the stone the builders rejected has become the capstone.
Okay. And who is the them?
To the renters.
Yeah, well, the ones that he's told the parable to, right?
Okay.
The them,
Yeah.
his audience.
Yeah.
Which is the people who said that's who he gave the parable to. Mm-hmm. So this then has a meaning to believers, also to disciples. That maybe we can do the same thing the Jews had done. We can reject our Messiah when we misuse what he's given us. He can become a stumbling block for us as well. Now, at the end, before, in the other Gospels he does this earlier, at the end, what's the reaction of the scribes and the Pharisees, or the scribes and the chief priests?
They wanted to lay hands on him.
They want to kill him because they see themselves in that parable and they decide they're going to kill him. Okay. We know the character, right? We've already known the character. What's the next encounter? So we've got this encounter, I think a powerful lesson, not just to the Jews, but also to Christians. We got to make use of the vineyard we've got because day of harvest is coming. What's the next encounter?
Paying taxes.
Okay, now we know Luke sets us up because we know exactly what's going on behind the question that they're going to ask. What is the motivation that Luke gives us right at the beginning? Before a question is asked, Luke tells us how we're supposed to interpret the question, right?
Keeping a close watch, you mean?
Okay, in verse 20, what is it? Verse 20. What does he say?
Keeping close watch on them, and he sent spies.
Okay, spies, right? And who are the they? The scribes and the Pharisees that were just mentioned, right? They sent scribes, and those spies
Pretended to be honest.
But why are they asking?
Hoping to
Question.
catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand them over.
So what kind of question are they going to ask him? If Luke tells us a question they're about to ask has to do with giving them the right to turn Jesus over to the authorities, not to the Jewish authorities, right? But the authority of the governor, so the Roman authorities. What are they going to ask him that is going to get him in trouble with the Romans, not with the Jews, right? And so what do they ask? What's the question? And we know the motivation. So this isn't a question they're asking because they really want to know. This is a question to get Jesus in trouble.
Yeah.
They want him to go against the law of Caesar. They want to say what belongs to Caesar, what belongs to God.
Okay. The question is very specific, right?
Yeah.
And we know that they're full of baloney because how do they address him?
Teacher.
They address him as teacher. And throughout Luke, when somebody calls Jesus teacher, that's not an adequate title for Jesus. If they believe in him, what would they call him? They call him Lord. That's what they would call him. Teacher is not an adequate title.
No,
The people
Lord.
that oppose him call him teacher. Scribes and the Pharisees call him teacher. Teacher doesn't mean much, but that's what they call him. So we know as soon as we knew before, because Luke tells us by the beginning of the question, we know that they're not sincere. They don't want to pick his brain because they think he's smart. And what question do they? Which means what they say afterwards is a lot of baloney. Right? Oh, teaching the law of God. They don't believe that. That's why they call him teaching. That's a lot of baloney. They're buttering him up, right?
Yep.
They want to trap him. And what is the exact question that they ask?
What is lawful?
Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Now, why is that a dangerous question?
Because it would depend on how he answered it.
Yeah, that becomes a dangerous question. Of course, it would be like a politician running for office now saying, "I'm going to increase your taxes." Is that person going to win?
No.
Not a chance. Now, if a politician says, "I'm going to cut your taxes,"
Yeah.
yeah, you might, even though I may have to borrow money to cut your taxes. I'm going to borrow money and give you the borrowed money as a tax cut. We'll vote for that. But if he says or she says, "I'm going to raise your taxes because we got what? Gosh, $14 trillion of debt. We better start paying it." Who's going to vote for them?
Nobody.
Nobody. Zero. Not going to do it. This is a powerful question. Should you pay your taxes? You got a bunch of Jews sitting there. Are they going to say, "Boy, I want to know if I should pay my taxes or not"? They're all thinking, "I want to pay taxes." Right? Mm-hmm. If he says, "Yes, you should pay your taxes," he's going to be in big trouble with the crowds. If he says,
No, you don't have to.
"You don't have to pay your taxes," then he's going to be in trouble with whom? With the Romans. Because the Romans are interested in what?
Money.
Money. The Romans are interested in money. That's all they're interested in. So telling people not to pay their taxes is a bad policy. The Romans want to get rid of that person. Now, again, I think this has a message that resonates with Luke's community. Not just the people then. And it's not just about taxes.
Right.
In the first century, you know why the Romans persecuted Christians? You know why the Romans persecuted Christians? Mm-mm. Why do you think the Romans persecuted Christians?
Money.
Well, that would be a good guess, because the Romans are really concerned about money. And in sort of a secondary way, it is about money. Now, most people would assume Romans persecuted Christians because they, what?
Followed Christ.
Followed Christ. Dun, 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 Elaine, give yourself a star. We assume that it's because they followed Christ. Romans hated Christian religion. But why did the Romans hate Christian religion? Ooh, good question. I'm glad I asked it. Why would they dislike Christian religion?
Because it didn't follow the law?
You know why they disliked Christians and Christian religion? Because Christians were bad Roman citizens. They were bad Roman citizens. Now, remember, in the Roman Empire, a whole bunch of religions. And the Roman Empire is trying to hold together people with different languages, different religions, different cultures. It is incredible. How do you hold together? Man, we're having a hard time doing it. How do you hold together an empire with all kinds of different people worshiping all kinds of gods? How do you hold that together? Because all those people are thinking to themselves, "Boy, I wish I were free. I wish I had my own country. Why should I be paying taxes to Rome? I should be helping myself, right?" So what the Romans did to hold this empire together is they did something really neat. The Romans said, but the Persians did the same thing in their empire. They said, we don't care who you worship. You worship anybody you want. Anybody you want. You don't have to worship anything at all. We don't care.
Just pay your taxes.
What we want you to do is we want you, along with whatever God or non-God you worship, we want you to participate in certain civic activities. Roman activities. Now, the civic activities are going to be centered around the emperor, because we all have one emperor. You may have other religions, but we have one emperor. And all you have to do is participate in civic activities that surround the emperor. We'll make sacrifices at these civic activities and have a big barbecue, and then you go home and worship any god you want. And we stay together as an empire. You know, you can be a Methodist and American, Presbyterian American. You know, you can have any religion you want as long as you're a good American, as long as you're a good Roman. Romans said that. What did the Christians say?
No, we're not.
We can't do that. We can't eat food sacrificed to the emperor. We can't do that. Because we have only one God. And the Romans said, if that idea spreads, what's going to happen to the empire? If other groups start getting the idea that we're not going to sacrifice to the emperor either. Well, we're not either. What happens to the empire?
It falls.
It falls apart. What happens to Roman tax money?
It disappears.
Gone. That's a danger. And Christians became a political danger to the Romans. They didn't care that Christians worshiped Jesus. They didn't care. They cared that Christians wouldn't participate in civic activities focused on the emperor. That's what the Romans didn't like. And I think that's floating behind this question. Should we pay taxes to the emperor? Because that's an issue that Luke's church faced. Because the opposition was saying, they're not good patriots. They're not Roman patriots. And it scared the Romans. And so this becomes a question, not just for Jesus in this context, but becomes an important question for Christians. And therefore, Jesus' answer becomes really important. And how does Jesus respond to this question that we know is trying to trap him?
Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar.
He asked for a
To
coin,
God.
right?
Yeah.
And because that's going to be a coin. And he says, who's on that coin?
Caesar's picture.
Caesar's picture. Now that's why you needed money changers, because you can't buy sacrificial animals with Roman coins, because it has Caesar's head on it. Okay, and it's got Caesar's head. And what does Jesus say?
Give
to Caesar what belongs to Caesar,
and to God what is God's.
Okay, now we give to Caesar that coin with Caesar's head on it, right? Mm-hmm. It bears the image of Caesar on that coin. What do we give to God?
Honor. Worship.
Clean.
Why?
Because he's God.
Why?
Why give to God what is God's?
Well, why? What are we giving to God, and why? You said worship, attention, and I agree with it. Why?
Because he deserves it, because he is God. He knows everything. He made the world. It's all his to begin with.
Listen to this. He takes a coin. Whose image is on that coin?
Caesar.
Caesar. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God. What carries the image? What carries the image of God?
We do.
We do. Yeah.
What did you say?
We do.
We
We
do.
do.
Oh, yeah, we do.
We
That's
do.
what I'm about to finish.
Who carries the image of God?
Yeah.
You know,
We do.
We do.
Right.
And I think
We are coins.
we are just like in the sense that
We are
just like
the image of
us, we carry the image of God, and therefore we belong to God, just like the coin belongs to
We
Caesar.
are valuable images of God.
Right. In Genesis, we were created
Equally.
in the image of God. So we become image carriers just like a coin is. And so when he answers, this is really a profound theological statement, but it becomes so important in Luke's community, because when people are pointing at you and saying, you're not a good patriot, you can say, look, I am going to give the Romans everything that belongs to the Romans. I am pro-Roman in every sense. I bear the image of God. I bear the image of God, therefore I belong to God. And that's how you can respond to this kind of opposition. Really, really neat things going on here. Not just theological, but things very practical. Who shows up? Verse 27. Let's get moving. Because now we got Sadducees. Okay.
I'm into this spot, go ahead.
Okay. The Sadducees show up. And who are the Sadducees? Luke tells us, which is fascinating. What does Luke tell us about Sadducees? He tells us all we need to know about Sadducees.
They don't believe in the resurrection?
They don't believe in the resurrection. Why does Luke, because I said before, I think Luke is the most sophisticated Jewish gospel of the four. Why does Luke here, which he doesn't in other places, have to explain to his audience, this is what a Sadducee believes? He didn't have to tell them what Pharisees believed, but he has to tell them what Sadducees believed.
Sadducees didn't really go anywhere. They were in the temple.
Yes, the Sadducees were in the temple. They were the ones that were focused on worship. Remember I told you there are different ways Jews saw their identity, focuses for their identity. Christian Jews saw the Messiah as their focus. I am a Jew because I follow the Messiah, the Christus. Pharisaic Jews, I am a Jew because I follow the law. Sadducees, I am a Jew because I worship in the temple. I focus on temple worship, right? First 5 books. Luke is writing this gospel when? When did I say Luke is writing this gospel? Who is reading this gospel?
Us.
People, well, we're reading
Yeah.
it. Luke is writing this to a community somewhere around 90-95 AD. Somewhere around 90-95 AD. And I think we mentioned it last week. Something very dramatic happened to the Jews in the year 70. You remember what? I think I mentioned it last week. What happened to the Jews in the year 70? AD 70. In the year 66, the Jews rebelled against the Romans. Independence. Romans defeat Masada, the zealots of Masada. Romans defeat the Jews, tear down the walls to Jerusalem, tear down the temple. They tear the temple down in the year 70 because they don't want to focus for future rebellion. People are rebelling. The temple becomes, we're fighting for the temple. You destroy the temple, we're fighting for
Nothing.
You don't have a rallying cry anymore. When the temple goes down, what do the Sadducees do? If their whole identity as Jews is centered around temple worship, what do the Sadducees do when the temple's gone?
Nothing.
They go. Nothing. So they disappear. When Luke is writing this, his people don't know what Sadducees are because they haven't been around for 20 years. Sadducees disappeared when the temple disappeared because you can only sacrifice in Jerusalem at the temple. And if there's no altar at the temple, you don't sacrifice. You don't need Sadducees. You don't need priests anymore either. They're gone. That's why the only Jews left are Pharisee Jews. They're the only ones that are still hanging around. That's the opposition. So he has to explain what a Sadducee believes. And they don't believe in the resurrection. They focus on the first 5 books of the Bible because that's where the sacrificial law is. And there's no mention of life after death in the first 5 books. When you die, you die. And your memory lives on in the minds of your friends and children. That's what the Sadducees believe. There's no resurrection of the dead. Now, that's also important because the Jews, Pharisaic Jews, and I think Luke's community believe that the only possibility you had for life after death was a resurrection. They didn't believe the body and soul could be separated. It was different, but you couldn't have disembodied souls any more than you could have bodies without souls. Therefore, you had to have the two together. And that's why the resurrection of the dead is so important. These Jews and Jewish Christians in Luke's church did not, and Paul, the Apostle Paul, read 1 Corinthians 15. They did not believe that when you died, your soul went up to be with God. They didn't believe that. Because you couldn't have souls without bodies. That's good Platonic philosophy. That's good Neoplatonic philosophy. That's Greek philosophy, that body and soul are separate. The Jews believe body and soul are tied together. And that's why to have a future life, what do you need? You need body and soul to be raised, right? You can't have souls without bodies or bodies without souls. That's why the resurrection of the dead is such a big deal. It's such a big deal. And that's the harvest, the resurrection of the dead. That's our future life. Man, we see that in Revelation too. This idea of a resurrection. Okay, that's what they believed. Okay? Now, the Sadducees, though, don't believe in a resurrection because life is, you live life and that's it. So what question do they ask? Which is really a boneheaded. This is the kind of question that people ask, can God create a rock too big for God to move? You know, it's a goofy question. What question do they ask?
If the brother dies, having a wife,
Yeah.
do they remarry? And then remarrying is to keep their memory alive.
Well, you know, in the law, according to the law, if Debbie marries me, if I die, then Debbie has to marry my brother.
And I would not want to marry anybody.
Yeah, that's what we have to do. That's what she has to do.
Well, like if he dies and she has to marry his brother, does she entitled to what he had? I mean, with her any kind of
Yes. In fact, we see it in Genesis, the whole story of Judah and Tamar, and it was really protection for the woman. It wasn't for the men. You know, if a woman is a widow, that's why in the law it says you got to take care of widows and orphans, because widows are in big trouble in the ancient world. You know, they are sort of on the fringe of society now, and so to protect them, it was an obligation that the brother would have to marry this person so that she isn't destitute, right? And that was the problem with Tamar, you know, in Genesis, that with Judah's sons. She marries one son, he dies. She marries the next son, he dies. And Judah's third son, she is supposed to marry her, and Judah says, you know, this is a black widow. I don't want my son to marry her. You know, because she goes through my sons, you know, like Grant went through Richmond. I mean, this is crazy. You know, so, you know, he's out of town. That's what he does. You know, he's out of town, which puts her in a horrible position. That's what he's asking. That's what they're asking. You know, the woman has gone through how many?
3.
Second, third, 7.
All 7 died.
7! You know, good perfect number. Then the woman dies at the resurrection. To whom is she married? Which of the 7? I mean, does she have a whole, you know, is she walking down the street with 7 guys following her?
Okay, so I'm confused because just like it says some Sadducees, or it says those who say there is no resurrection.
Right.
Okay, and then we go down after all the story, and then they say, in the resurrection, therefore. So if you don't believe in the resurrection, why are you asking a question about the resurrection?
Great. Why would you ask a question about the resurrection if you didn't believe in it?
Right.
Trying to find
Why would
out
you?
whatever people believes in it.
Trip him up.
Because this question makes it look stupid. Makes the resurrection look stupid. I mean, it makes the resurrection look like a bunch of nonsense. They're being sarcastic. You know, just like the wise guy who says, if God can do anything, can he create a rock too big for him to move? What a dumb question.
Yes.
You don't want an answer to that. that's a question to make you, to put you on your heels, to make your faith look stupid. I mean, that's the only purpose. And that's what they were doing. They were asking a question to make the resurrection appear foolish, right? And I believe this was probably a standard Sadducee question that they'd ask Pharisees. And if the Pharisees took the bait, and hummed and hawed, and then they could say, see, look at how stupid the whole idea of the resurrection is absurd. And how does Jesus answer?
Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage.
So what's his answer?
It's a bunch of hooey.
Yeah, well, his answer is, you don't understand the resurrection. You're assuming the resurrection is like life on earth. It ain't. It's a different world. Shut up. Do something useful rather than come up with stupid questions. He explains what the resurrection, which can be helpful to us if we believe that the resurrection is going to be different. That's what Paul says. But it's not like it is now. That's just dumb. That's just a dumb thing. You're acting like a dope. But he goes further, because he then proves the resurrection. And what does he do to prove that the resurrection must be true? What does Jesus say? What does he say in verse 37 to prove that the resurrection must be?
And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is God, not of the dead, but of the living. For to him, all of them are alive.
How does that prove the resurrection? How would that prove the resurrection? Because we know it does, because the scribe, this is the only positive thing a scribe says in the whole gospel. Says, you spoke well, and the scribes and the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees did. So we know the answer is a good one. So how does that prove the resurrection? That's really a good response, because it's really kind of an interesting logic behind that response. If Moses talks about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if we assume that Isaac, if we believe that you don't have disembodied souls, that souls and bodies are united, and if we believe that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are not just dead, but they have something to do with God, they have a future with God, then there has to be a resurrection sometime in the future. That Moses isn't just rattling off 3 dead people. He's talking about 3 people who are going to be in the presence of God. That are living in the sense that they're going to have life, especially if I believe that the body and soul are together. There has to be a resurrection in the future. They have to have some kind of life in the future. That's the logic. I'm not saying it's great logic, but I think that's his point. That's what he's making. The point he's making. And Luke sees it as good because the Pharisee, the scribe, says it's a good answer. All right, and we're really running late, and I apologize. Who takes it? So he's answered question and nobody answers anymore. Who takes the initiative in asking questions in 41?
Jesus himself.
And you're doing a real good job. Between me kind of meandering and Coco barking, you're hanging in there, and it's getting really warm. What does he ask him? Because this is another one that has logic that's kind of sketchy.
Yeah, it took me a minute to realize Jesus is asking this question. How can they say that the Messiah is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.
Yeah, what's the point? Because that's sort of like what he just said. Logically, is a little sketchy. This is a little sketchy. What's the point? Because he doesn't dwell on it. He kind of moves away from it. If David calls, if in the book of Psalm, in the Psalter, if David calls this one who is coming Lord, that would suggest that the one who is coming has what? Authority
of heaven
over,
or the earth.
yes, both is true. Over, if David calls this future one Lord, then this future one Lord has authority over David. Right?
Right, you gave him
Right.
the king, so.
Yes,
it's
that means he has
separating
authority.
Earthly kingdom
Well,
to heavenly kingdom.
I don't even think you're
Okay.
right. I think you're right, but I don't even think it's that deep.
Okay.
What he's saying is, if David calls his son Lord, that means his son has authority over him, which doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. For David, if the Messiah is David's son, then why is David calling him Lord? So I think it's what it does, and I think it does it in a very subtle way. It undercuts, the idea that the Messiah has to be in the line of David. But Luke has already established that he is. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure why you have this, but you do.
I think it's saying that the Lord said to my Lord, being the Lord said to myself, because David is referred to as Lord with his authority. Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.
No, and it should be confusing because I think I don't think it's a particularly strong point, but I think that's what he's getting at. That your expectation related to the Messiah, maybe you don't worry about so many of the details. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know. It's a sketchy thing. Why Luke he has a reason. I'm not sure I fully understand it. But it also shows up in Matthew and Mark. So all three of them see that this is something important to establish. Maybe it had greater meaning in the first century than it does in the 21st. I don't know.
I think Lord means two different things. The Lord means God said to my Lord, myself, is an authority.
Yeah, that would got me, the Lord said to the Lord.
Is a human
I know
authority.
what you're saying.
So he's talking to David, but that's just how David words it, because he's saying that God is telling even his authority.
I think
Chapter 44, he says, David therefore called him Lord. How is he then his son?
and that becomes it's that last statement that becomes the hard part. His point is, how can David call the Lord his son?
Right.
And yet he does. And that's where the logic kind of breaks down. So I think it has to do with the expectations of who the Lord is. I guess. I guess. And I hate doing this because I really don't see
I don't get this.
that powerful boom in here. But I don't know. 45, talking to disciples. What does he say to disciples?
Beware the scribes.
Okay, beware the scribes. Why should they beware of the scribes?
Because they love to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have best seats in the synagogue.
Okay, so they like to brag and boast.
Show off.
Negative, they're show-offs. Negative number one. Negative number two.
Right, and then they preach things of the Old Testament, but then they go do everything bad. They devour widows.
They devour widows, which is violation of the law.
They preach one thing, they do the other.
Yeah, they love, they're full of pride, they're show-offs, they devour widows. And they love to do what?
Make long prayers.
Long prayers. They love long prayers.
They just like to hear themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you something. That's one of the things, and as I've looked at myself over the years, you know, when I pray in church, and y'all who've heard me obviously know this, based on what I pray, I don't write anything down. I don't write prayers out. And that's an intentional thing. That I have never written prayers, even with communion. And a lot of ministers, and I have nothing against it. I'm not saying that's wrong by any means. But they'll have it written down and they'll read the prayer. And that's fine. You know, I'm not criticizing them. For me, this bothers me when I write it down.
Yeah.
This bothers me.
It should be
You know,
instantaneously.
that
like
all of a
the story.
sudden I am more concerned about my sentence structure and my word choice. And that bothers me. Now, again, I'm not imposing that on anybody else. Nobody else. And I've heard beautiful prayers prayed that had to have been worked out beforehand. They're structured too well.
If you write prayers
Which is
like
all right.
that, if that's your intention to write a prayer like that, but when prayer comes from your heart, in
Yes.
church, you preach prayer from
Well-
your heart.
well-
You write down prayers from your heart, it's from your heart.
Right,
Same.
and I'm glad you said it that way, Elaine. I think a person, a minister who writes his prayers or her prayers out and prays them, I think that can be coming from the heart too. No problem. For me though, I know me, I would be focused on my word choice. I'd be focused on my grammar. I'd worry about splitting infinitives. I wouldn't want to dangle participles.
You're a teacher.
Those are things that I think about. And if you listen to a sermons, I don't dangle participles and I don't split infinitives.
Well, I don't even know what
You
a
know?
dangling participle
Well,
is
that's
anymore.
right. Well, if you want to find out, don't listen to my sermons because you'll never find one, because I know I don't do it because I'm aware of it. But that's what I do, you know. But I don't want that to be my focus in praying. And that's here. And finally, the widow giving the coin who gave more, certainly the widow than the rich man. Kind of again a judgment towards scribes and Pharisees. I think all of these things he's teaching, you could take it on two levels. One, what he's doing in this context, but also what is the message he's conveying to the Christians later. And that's what I want you to hear. You know, and that's what I want you to think about. In these lessons, and it's taken us a long time to get here, and again, I apologize. What is the message he wants his Christian community to take? Okay? That's what I want you to... She thinks that's for her.
I know.
Lord have mercy. I don't even want
This is for grandma.
Now, anytime you want to talk about, and there's some things that I feel we belabored, other things we passed through quickly. If there's anything you want to talk about, I will more than happy to talk about it. I'm going to close so that y'all who need to go, because I've kept you way too long. And if you want to talk about things with resurrection of the dead and stuff. Huh?
If it was too long, we would have left.
Well, I mean, I hope you would, but you're very polite people, and so you may not. So let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together, and bless us as we seek to apply your word to our lives. In the name of Christ we pray, amen, 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 amen.